Right, it's preparing to live stream now.
Are we good to go?
Yes, Chairman, we're good to go. It's now live streaming on YouTube.
Thank you, Joanne. Good afternoon and welcome to this meeting of East Lindsey's Planning Policy Committee. I'm Councillor Tom Ashton, I'm the chairman of this committee, and I will ask Elaine to take a roll call to register our attendance. If you could indicate if you're present, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Ashton.
I'm present.
Councillor Jimmy Brooks.
Present.
Councillor Dennis is an apology. Councillor Dickinson is an apology. Councillor Grover.
Present.
Councillor Howard.
Yes, I'm here.
Councillor Kemp. Councillor Kemp.
Present. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Macmillan.
Present.
Councillor McNally.
Present.
Councillor Matthews is an apology. Councillor Smith.
Present.
And we've got Councillor Mossop. He's substituting for Councillor Dickinson today. So Councillor Mossop.
Present.
And that concludes the roll call for the record of attendance. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. The second item is disclosures of interest. Does anyone have anything that they wish to disclose in relation to the items on the agenda today? Seeing no one waving at me, if anything comes up in the course of the meeting, let me know and we'll deal with it then. Item 3 is minutes of the meeting held on Thursday, the 17th of September. I will assume that everyone has had opportunity to read those minutes. Does anyone have any issues to raise concerning them? Seeing no one, am I okay to have your consent to approve those minutes? Because of the expediencies of time, we're not going to take a roll call, but if anyone would like to dissent, if you would kindly raise your hand, I will. Councillor Brooks.
Yeah, I vote to approve.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to second, and if there's no one indicating dissent, we'll take that as approval. Thank you very much. Item 4 is actions of the last meeting. Is there anything that anyone would like to pick up on those? I'll take them as read. Thank you. Item 5 is the update from the licensing team, caravan sites and local development orders. And I will hand over to David Dodd, who joins us for this meeting, to take us through that item. Thank you, David.
David, I think you're still muted.
No, I've sorted it. Unmute didn't work to start with. Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Obviously, I'm the Environmental Health Manager for East Lindsey, and I've recently inherited the caravan site licensing function that was originally in the Planning Enforcement Unit. Historically, Environmental Health have previously been responsible for the enforcement of Caravan Site and Controller Development Act licences, of which there are many hundred across the coastal strip, as I'm sure you're aware. With the local development order side of things, there comes an additional sort of level of responsibility, I feel, in terms of ensuring that the caravan site and Control of Development Act conditions for the caravan sites are adhered to as a result of sites wishing to open for a longer period of time to extend their seasons. Clearly, as a result of the sort of the COVID side of things, as with all the other sort of environmental health functions, we're about sort of supporting the local economy and business in the first instance. So in terms of the enforcement side of things, we would want to sort of try and take the same approach with caravan sites that we take with all the other sort of businesses, in terms of engaging with them and supporting them in trying to either do things differently or comply with the law in sort of the first instance. We're currently working in conjunction with colleagues in the planning unit and the planning enforcement unit in terms of the sort of the finer points of how we propose to sort of enforce the conditions that will be on caravan sites if they choose to expand their holiday season into the sort of the LDO criteria. So I think it's safe to say that sort of enforcement response, we're looking at it being proportionate to how compliant the sites are. Some sites may have more works to do than others in terms of availing themselves of this sort of ability to open over the winter months. Clearly, we'll work with any site in order to make sure that they're best placed to comply with these additional conditions. And the main sort of key thing really from the enforcement side of things will be preventing the year-round occupation of any sort of caravans in a manner that would be as though it was their permanent address. The whole idea behind the LDO is to support the sort of the tourist economy and not to create a mechanism for some sort of alternative or cheap accommodation for people on low incomes or who may be vulnerable and have sort of little other options in terms of accommodation. This is about sort of enhancing the period of time that vans can be used for holiday use only and not as an alternative sort of cheap method of housing. That's going to be the real sort of challenge, I think, going forward with the sort of the sites that do wish to use them sort of for 12 months, is making sure that that sort of holiday use is adhered to, and that we're not ending up with a problem as we found on other sites in the district as a result of COVID, where people are actually trying to live in the vans as their permanent address. That is going to be sort of quite challenging in terms of the number of sites that we've got and the sort of the level of manpower that will be required to sort of patrol and police that. We're currently working on what that's sort of going to look like, as I say, in conjunction with colleagues in the planning enforcement unit as well, and with a slight sort of alteration to some of the working practices in the unit that I've inherited. We're working up how best to respond to that. We are sort of in uncharted territory, as it were, from that respect of things. In terms of where we're at so far, looking at the sort of lists that have come through to date, we've had probably about 25 applications under the LDO hit the system so far. As part of that, we're going to be sort of working up a means of making it clear to any sort of caravan site owners that getting granted permission under the LDO doesn't absolve them from their requirements under the caravan site licensing conditions that are imposed, and if they extend the season, there is a raft of additional conditions that they will be expected to comply with. And again, we're going to look at taking a proportionate approach to enforcement on those, given that the local development order is initially for 2 years. So it's really getting them to recognise that if there are upgrades to the site that's needed, to start putting those in place during that 2-year period. And clearly, if the LDO gets extended, then they're in a good place to comply going forward. So that's probably a brief run through and a quick run through where we're at the minute. I'm happy to take any sort of questions from councillors and colleagues if they wish to ask any sort of further finer points around the enforcement of it.
Thank you very much, David. It is heartening and encouraging to read through some of these lists of additional licensing conditions, and to hear the report and presentation that you've just given. To my mind, it's absolutely key that we're able to give robust reassurance to our partner organisations, partner agencies, that we are taking our responsibilities and safety responsibilities incredibly seriously. And it also goes as far as to say that clearly what we're looking at doing with the local development orders isn't going to be for every site. It is going to, it is coming with serious responsibilities, because it's only by taking on those serious responsibilities that we can satisfy even ourselves that it's safe to do this. I was very pleased to hear from members of the committee, and in order I have Councillor Mossop.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to be here as a sub again. I was curious to see that we don't charge for this licensing work, David. And I suppose really the debate for me in terms of licensing is should we be paying, should people be charging for this kind of work? Because it obviously involves a lot of East Lindsey's time and your time now. It's a new responsibility, additional work with the granting of the LDO, it appears. You know, how many members of staff are particularly tied up with this kind of work? I don't want to be the Grinch in terms of charging for everything, but I do feel we've got to wash our faces at least and cover up some of our costs with this. After all, we do pay for all our licenses for motoring cars, TVs and whatever. So my question is probably to the committee as well, is why not for the caravan licensing? Also, I think in your briefing there was this mention that there are certain sites that are completely exempt. I don't know whether you just mean those are the very small 5-van certification sites, or whether there are other sites that are specifically exempt, and for what reason that is. So I'd be interested to know whether they are, and whether there's anything that anywhere you'd find that are slipping under the wire somehow. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mossop. David, do you want to pick up these points one by one as councillors ask them, please?
Yeah, no problem. In respect to the charging side of things, the only sites that we're absolutely able to levy any sort of charge for are those residential sites. So that's ones that are permitted to be lived in as though it's a residential property permanently. They're governed under a different set of legislation, which is the Mobile Homes Act. That came into force in April 2014, and that does permit a full sort of cost recovery charging regime that I'm currently in the process of working with colleagues in finance to review the scheme of fees and charges on those to help support the service in terms of the holiday use sites. In terms of the sites that are regulated under the Caravan Site and Controller Development Act, as you'll see from the year that the Controller Development Act was born, being 1960, it hasn't moved with the times yet, and there is nothing under there that permit, and it were actually prohibited by that act, I believe, and I will make doubly sure of this, but I believe that we're actually prohibited under that act from levying any form of charge for site licensing regimes administered under that act. So that prohibits us sort of making a charge for that licensing system. So from that point of view, that isn't something that we can bring in, although we can make sure that for the other aspect of caravan sites under the Mobile Homes Act, that it is a full cost recovery system that is sort of proportionate to the works that's carried out.
Can I just interrupt on that one, Chairman, and just go back, because we had a controversy some years ago in terms of I think it was probably the Public Health Act of 1896 or the Urinals Act or something, that we were not allowed to charge for public conveniences. But subsequently, we've gone ahead and done that. So are there any exemplars around the country where they actually override this legislation and are beginning to charge, and whether it's something that's appropriate or not? Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McNally.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not sure, David, whether who set the extra licence conditions, whether it's you or whether you're just enforcing them because they're set by someone else. But looking at these extra site licence conditions, I wouldn't say anything was totally out of the way of what would normally be expected at a caravan site that I'm, visited in the past and stuff. But one of the things that I thought would be on there was an evacuation plan. And I'm a bit disappointed to see there isn't one, unless it comes under a different regime or something. I'm not sure. That's it. Thank you.
I've inherited the site license conditions from they were being created sort of previously in terms of the extended season. In terms of the requirement for a evacuation plan and such like, that's actually covered off in the LDO itself, and in order to comply with availing yourself of the sort of requirements of the LDO, that has to be submitted up front as part of the application process, and that's then verified and checked through the emergency planning function of the council, which is currently John Challen and James Gilbert, and that's in conjunction with the LRF. So all of those evacuation plans and flood risk assessments have to be submitted up front, I believe. So that's sort of taken care of elsewhere.
That's fine, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Brooks.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, David, for the update. Much appreciated. It's pretty similar to Councillor Mossop's, really. It sounds like you're going to need a lot more people to basically produce what we really need to be done. So it sounds like your department might need some more funding, basically. If we can't charge, is there any way that we can get some kind of funding from somewhere else in East Lindsey for extra staff, which you are going to need, to be honest? Also, regarding the legislation, is there any way anybody could sort of like make a request to government to look at changing that, considering what's going to be happening very shortly? Thank you.
In terms of external sort of base funding, I don't believe there is a mechanism for that, sadly. as I've said previously, one part of sort of bolstering this sort of side of things up is to review the fees and charges under the Mobile Homes Act to try and sort of separate that side of things out. So that could then be potentially in forms of staffing, that's staffed separately through the fees and charges regime of that would then free staff time up to look at this. In addition to that, the way the unit that I've inherited is structured, staff are doing multiple roles within that unit in terms of both the waste enforcement, environmental crime, and the caravan sites side of things. Between myself and Christian now, in terms of the new sort of amalgamated unit, we're looking at sort of reviewing how that whole function is delivered across the strategic alliance, which we're hopeful that will result in some improvements in terms of staffing and the ways of working for the waste side of things, that will hopefully release some more time to devote to the caravan site aspect of the roles. And there are a couple of posts that I've inherited from that unit that are currently vacant as well, that we need to sort of look at how that unit is crafted in terms of delivering the enforcement for the sort of the caravan aspect, so that it is more proactive and a more sort of robust enforcement regime than probably what we've got currently, because it is I think the best way of putting it at the minute is a very, very sort of light touch enforcement approach, and quite reactive. Whereas I think with the inception of the LDO and the volume of caravans that we have got in East Lindsey, it needs to be a more proactive enforcement regime that isn't probably too dissimilar to the food hygiene regime that we operate in environmental health. And clearly, if there's, with all the sort of reshuffles and rejigs with the strategic alliance that may come along, hopefully we would be able to sort of staff that. But it really, that's a further sort of piece of work that's currently ongoing to try and make sure that it's staffed appropriately given the volume of sites that we've got.
Thank you. Mike, you've got your hand up. Would you like to come in at that point?
Yes, thank you, Councillor Ashton. I think members have raised a valid point around the fees, and I think we could probably take it away as an action to have a look into the legislation and obviously look at to optimise our fees if we are able to do so in that regard. I think the other two things I would say is we, in terms of planning enforcement and the caravan site licensing, although there's been that transition, the two should be working hand in glove. And we're going to look to make the decision notices on the LDO very clear in that, you know, just because you're granted the authorisation under the LDO, you've still got these additional bits that you have to comply with, and equally try and encourage people to get on the front foot and put those applications and those requests in, as opposed to us having to chase continually through enforcement. But equally, we've got that synergy that if a planning enforcement officer is going out there because we've got somebody in potential breach, then they can pick up the site licensing crossover as well in that regard. So we are very much working to make sure this isn't a resource hungry initiative, but I think it would be worth David and myself taking this away as an action based on the sentiments that have been raised in terms of looking at that fees and charges where we might be able to or not.
Thank you, Mike. And for my part, I'm entirely supportive if there is a means of covering the cost of this authority through reasonable fees and charges. I'm completely supportive of that, and especially given that the importance of effective enforcement around the requirements of the local development order, the evacuation plan, the flood risk assessments, as well as these licensing conditions, in order to have absolute faith and confidence that safety is completely paramount. Then, as I say, we need to have complete reassurance that conditions are being complied with, and to come down like a ton of bricks on anywhere where they're not being, because that would undermine everything of what we're trying to do here, and the reassurances that I'm keen to be able to give to partner organisations. So I'm always very keen to make sure that there isn't going to be a resourcing issue around this, and that we can be confident on that basis. Councillor Howard is next.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to make a couple of other points, but just firstly on this particular issue, I think with East Lindsey's position of being one of the leading areas for caravan holidays, we would be in an ideal position to actually go to government, possibly by our local MPs, to lobby for an amendment to the necessary acts, so that we can actually not look at ways round the problem, but get the problem removed. And I would actually like to propose that we as a district council do actually go to government and ask them to look at this legislation and allow for fees and charges in the future through an amendment. Just picking up on a couple of other things, I'm maybe running ahead a little bit, but I'm assuming that with the conversation that we've had, that any sort of policing will be done via the register that's being maintained by the site operator and checking their records. And to quote yourself, Chair, a ton of bricks to fall upon people. Well, will we have a ton of bricks to actually drop on them, or will it be a £5 fine and a slap over the wrist? What's going to back that up? How do we get that ton of bricks in place? And the very first item on the conditions was to say that there must be a full-time site warden. Now, if sites are looking only to open for a short period, be it the Christmas period, does that mean that they must have a full-time site warden for that period? Or if they're going to be on site for the whole time, i.e. they are full-time across the year? I think that the wording is maybe a little bit loose there. I know what we're trying to say, I think, but we don't quite say it, if you're with me on that one. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Would you like to pick those questions up, David, please?
Yeah, in terms of the site warden side of things, if I would sort of take that there needs to be somebody on site during that extended period. I think that we maybe need to sort of clarify the wording of that somewhat.
Yeah, David, that was how I was reading it.
Yeah, because
it does look as if you're opening for 2 or 3 weeks during the winter, that you must have somebody on site all of the winter. And I thought I knew what I was trying to say, but I didn't think it quite got it correct in that. And I'm pleased to hear you'll look at that. Thank you.
Yeah, that needs to be sort of, we either need to clarify around that of the meaning of point A, or look at a mechanism for rewording that from that side of things. So in terms of the issue of altering the actual act itself, clearly that will be something for central government to consider, I think. But in my view, it certainly wouldn't be overdue from that respect, because it is a very old sort of act of Parliament. In terms of the enforcement side of things of that act, unlike most modern acts, it contains no capacity for any form of legal notice or anything to be served to effect works to be required. The only enforcement redress under that is prosecution direct to the magistrates court. So, and that's a straight, you are not complying with your site license conditions or of the type on this list, then creates an offence under the Act. And that's the only powers that are under there. There is a power to revoke a site license, but that has a protracted mechanism of requiring 3 visits to the magistrate court before you can require a site license to be revoked, preventing the site from operating. So in terms of actual sort of enforcement of the conditions under that Act, yes, there are enforcement powers, but they are just direct to a magistrate's court for straight offences, as opposed to any form of legal improvement notice in the same way that we have for the food hygiene regime or the health and safety regime, and or things like prohibition notices. They also don't exist under this Act, predominantly because of its age. So from that respect, yes, there are powers, and historically East Lindsey have taken sites to task and have secured quite high levels of fine against sites, and have also revoked site licenses as a result of sort of misdemeanors under this Act. But it becomes very labour intensive, because the only redress is you have to prepare a full court case.
Thank you, Councillor Smith.
Thank you. I was interested to hear you talking about your fears around all year round residency, because this is something which came up at parish meetings for me as a concern, although not with the very valid concern about providing cheap accommodation year round for those who can least afford it, but rather the sort of high end sort of lodge type properties, which are much more desirable to live in all year round, and can therefore circumvent proper planning and so on. So I'd be interested to see if you've got any real teeth in terms of making sure that doesn't happen. I also notice, well, in the list of recommendations, you've got things like waste removal. I'm also aware that one of the key areas of worry in waste is that caravan park waste is rarely recycled, and that this is a big hole in our recycling strategy. I wondered if there is any scope for including some sort of provision for recycling or encouragement of recycling within those regulations that you've put there, seeing as there is one about, you know, weekly, or was it twice weekly, I can't remember now, waste removal. I just thought that might be something we could expand. Thank you.
Okay, in terms of the year-round occupancy, that is sort of obviously part and parcel of the additional site license conditions, in that any caravan occupiers must prove a council tax reference number as proof of a proper residential status of a permanent address other than the caravan site. Again, that's reliant on site operators harvesting that information and it being honest and truthful, which is then something from a regulatory point of view, that you need to spend time unpicking those that are not being so and take them to task over it. And obviously make an example of anybody that is flouting those rules, because the whole purpose of this is for holiday accommodation. So in terms of the sort of the teeth around that, again, that would be a breach of the site licence conditions, which is prosecutable in the magistrates court. And it goes back to the age of the Act again. There's no notice that you can serve, so you would have to look at the level of flouting of that rule on a site and make an enforcement decision as to whether or not it warranted actually putting before the magistrates court for breach of that, given the sort of reasons behind the breach that could occur in that it was providing substandard year-round accommodation to people that could ill afford it. So that's that side of things. Just in terms of the more sort of fancy end of the holiday market, if you like, in terms of lodges and such like that are proliferating across the district. In terms of sort of the definitions of caravan under the Control of Development Act, often these lodges don't actually fulfill the definition of a caravan under the Act. Therefore, those sort of parts of sites with lodges on are not subject particularly to the same level of licensing requirements as what a mobile home or a caravan would be. Even though some of the static mobile homes and caravans are huge, they still have a set of wheels on and they are delivered on the back of a trailer. Many of the lodges, once they're sited, that's it, they're sited there for forever. So although there's bits in between those, some of the lodge type designs are more mobile than others. So that has to be taken on a case-by-case basis, I'm afraid. But a lot of the fixed lodges won't be sort of covered under this. It would be covered under the sort of any planning conditions for the site, and also the sort of the health and safety enforcement regime in terms of sort of the electrical safety and everything else of those sort of that accommodation. And in terms of year-round occupancy of those, again, that would be tied in more with the planning aspect of the site and conditions therein, I feel. So that's that side of things. In terms of the recycling of waste, yes, there is a condition in terms of regular refuse collection and disposal service must be maintained on a weekly basis. In terms of amending those conditions, we might find it's a bit of a protracted mechanism to include recycling in there, but that's certainly something that we can sort of pick up, I think, as an action point to look at in terms of working on the sort of recycling of waste on caravan sites. It's a very mixed bag out there in terms of that. Some sites do already have segregation of waste on site in terms of separating out the waste streams. Others just commingle it and the whole thing goes to landfill. So that is something that I think we probably need to look at as an action point going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. The last speaker on this is Councillor Mossop, and after that, I'd really like us to wrap this one up, because I appreciate we've got certainly two fairly big items that I imagine you'll all want to get your teeth into shortly. So, Councillor Mossop, please.
Thank you very much for allowing me to come back, Chairman. It was just really to not lose sight of what Councillor Howard had said about lobbying DCLG or our local MPs about this, because I think from a political point of view, we should be putting that pressure over to central government about the issues as well. So in addition to what Mike Gildersleeves has said about the action points in terms of this charging to investigate, I'd like to see that we use a two-pronged attack on this going forward. So I hope that's in the recommendations, and we can agree that. You know, I do worry, David Dodds, when you say, you know, we have to have a light touch because of resources. You know, that rings horribly, you know, memories of what we've had in the past on the coast about permanent residence and residency. And Tony Howard will know all about that coming from Mablethorpe.
Too true.
You know, and I know that, you know, chalets are still of permanent occupied, which are traded. They move from person to person. Unfortunately, they are woefully inadequate, and we really must not allow that to drift into other sites as well. So you know, more power to your elbow, David. You've done you know, taking this on. It's a challenge. It's good work that you do anyway. We know that through your other environmental work. So we just hope we can support you politically, that we can get something moving forward in terms of charging and getting this system to wash its face. Thank you. I'm just going to have to take a phone call.
If I might interject, I did use the word that I proposed, and I was hoping that maybe, Ed, you might want to second. So that
well, that was what I probably missed out. I thought I did say that, but it was in, I wanted to second that.
Excellent.
And I'm just going to have to take a phone call. It'll be 5 minutes. I'm going to stop my video and mute.
Thank you very much, Councillor Mossop and Howard. Yeah, you're pushing a completely open door on that, and I'm happy for it to be included as an action point from this meeting. That in collaboration with Mike and David, that we put a set of words together, that we can send that letter, and we'll report back to this meeting, or to a future one of these meetings, the response we get. But I think it's also going to be relevant to have a further discussion through the portfolio side of things, on resourcing and everything else, and again to report back to this meeting in the future, in either the next meeting or the one after, on the point that you're raising.
Okay, that's excellent, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David, for a incredibly detailed presentation, and for taking the time to answer councillors' queries. This is one of those areas where planning and licensing start from completely different places and end up in the same. And it's good that we've got an understanding of how the licensing side operates, and that you get an understanding of where members on the planning side feel that they would like licensing to be complementing what we're doing with this committee. So genuinely appreciate the time that you put into this, and I think it might be useful, as I say, further to what we were just talking about with lobbying and resourcing and stuff. I will pick this up with Mike separately. It might be an idea if we include you on a portfolio meeting at some point, just so that we can be sure that if you need resourcing, then I'd be very happy to speak to Councillor Fry and make sure that there's money in the pot for it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to item 6, which is the briefing paper on the retail assessment, which I think is Simon's paper, if I am right. Simon.
It is indeed. Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, as the Chairman explained, the next paper presents the members with a brief to tender to refresh our retail assessments. As you can see from the paper, the last assessments were carried out quite a number of years ago. So by the time we get to the point of submitting the local plan for the review, this piece of evidence will be significantly out of date. So the aim of this piece of work is to get these refreshed into a single piece of work. So it's going to draw together all of the districts of the towns, and it will all of the districts' towns, and it will also include Spilsby as well, which wasn't included in the previous studies. So the retail assessments are a key piece of work and a key piece of evidence for the local plan. They're used to understand the shopping habits and trends in the district. The studies will look at both comparison and convenience goods. So convenience goods being your everyday items that people purchase like bread and milk, and then your comparison goods being your larger, more one-off purchases such as your electronic goods, televisions, washing machines, and clothes as well. So the assessments will look at the different types of retail across the district. They'll look at the available retail floor space at the moment. They'll assess what additional floor space is needed. It will look at zones of influences for the different towns, where any leakages to larger towns outside of the district. And also built into it will be an assessment of supermarket provision as well. So again, both existing provision and then the potential additional need for supermarket floor space. So the importance of it, we use this evidence to help shape the policies that relate to economic growth and how we manage town centres, town centre shopping and out of town centre shopping as well. So anything that's on the edge or more removed from the town centres towards your business parks and your industrial estates as well. Policy SP14, for example, we have our own locally defined threshold of 1,000 square metres where an individual retail assessment is needed for a planning application. So the NPPF actually sets it at 2,500 square metres unless you do set a local one. So the retail assessments will help us to establish whether there's a need to still retain that 1,000 square metre threshold for ourselves, whether that needs changing or not. I don't really want to go into too much more. It's fairly clear in the paper what the brief's for, and I think I've gone through it in a reasonable amount of detail. So I'll just draw members' attention to the recommendation at the end there, and open it up to any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Simon. Councillor Howard.
Thank you, Chair. I don't disagree that this is something that needs looking at, but I just wonder whether this is the right time to be doing it. And I'll give you a kind of little storyboard. Where we were was probably on top of the mountain, and I think at the moment we're kind of skiing down that mountain. And I would have said that the time to do the reassessment is when we've reached the bottom and we know where we've landed, because there's such a change in habits going on at the moment. There was a gradual move to online trading, but COVID has thrown a complete spanner in the works, and that has accelerated the decline of the high street, if that's how you'd like to call it. And so, whilst I don't disagree that this work needs doing, I'm just worried that actually by the time we've done it, will it be out of date again? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Simon, would you like to pick on that one?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I take your point. We are in a very difficult sort of position at the moment in terms of trying to get some true idea. But then that said, given COVID-19 and the impacts, I think even more so now we need to understand what the trends are, what the changing trends are. Any evidence that you take is always going to be a snapshot of that particular point in time, and things will change. They could get better, they could get worse, trends could change one way or another. It's very difficult to keep putting off, forgive me for using that phrase, but putting off research and pushing it back, because you're always going to have something changing in the world economy, in social economics. There's always going to be something changing. And as I say, I think at the moment, more than ever, it's important that we do try and understand how COVID-19 is impacting on trends. And that's certainly something that will be built into it. It would be expected that any consultant, and it would be built into the brief, it will be expected that any consultant does take that into account and attempt to factor that into any assessment that they make.
Am I right in my understanding that this paper seeks to go out to tender for the work? So the piece of work realistically would be taking place next year rather than immediately. Is that right? What are the precise timescales on when this will start?
Yes, that's correct, Chairman. The procurement process does take some time in itself, and awarding contract and then the inception, initiating the contract. I don't envisage it actually commencing and them actually getting into the meat and potatoes of the work until I suspect it will be springtime next year anyway. Obviously, we want to try and get it started as soon as we can. So depending on how things are going in terms of COVID-19, we may or may not be seeing some changes again. Obviously, we've been up and down as it has been for the last 8 months. We've slowly come out of it, and then slowly other places are going back into lockdown. So it's very difficult to predict. But certainly, yeah, by the time they get to the summaries and conclusions, we'll be moving in, I suspect, to the summer of next year. And we may have a clearer picture. But obviously, the review itself is due to be submitted by April 2022. So if we move back this evidence gathering, we start to eat into the time we've got to actually carry out all the things we need to do for the review anyway.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I do appreciate it's a tough call. My concern was just that we were going to spend, several tens of thousands of pounds, and there's the option of us, wasting that money quite easily. But I do agree, it's a tough call. Yeah, thank you.
It is a fine balance. Yeah, it's very difficult to judge.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on this point. As Simon said, there's never going to be a right or wrong time to get this done. Clearly, as the evidence dates further, that does mean that we are in a more susceptible position to speculative applications that come along with their own evidence bases, etc. So we've got to bear that in mind as well. But in essence, what you're talking about, Councillor Howard, is almost an element of sensitivity testing that comes in as part of that brief. So what we're actually saying is we'll put the brief out, we'll see what the consultants feel is when we interview them, etc., as part of that tendering process and how they would approach the work. And then there are going to be those options, those analyses of different variables that come out and sensitivities that go with that in terms of, does the downward slope continue more? Do we come back on a sharp trajectory back up? Do we have the Nike swoosh or whatever it may well be? So it's something that, we are in a better position by getting on doing it now. And I don't see it being abortive in one shape or any, really.
And I suppose trying to put a positive spin on it, at least we'll be less wrong than we were. Yeah, okay.
Councillor Brooks.
Thank you, Chairman. I totally agree with Councillor Howard, but obviously the report needs doing, but as long as it's not starting until sort of like May, June next year, otherwise it's going to be wasted money, I'm afraid. I said online, I've seen the shift. It's like every week's like Christmas. So the high street, and the longer this goes on, the worse the high street's going to be. Online has always been going up and up, but now it's just gone up thousands percent basically. So we do have to be careful that we're not doing this, doing this before May, June next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Grover.
Yeah, I was just going to say I don't disagree with any of the comments that have been said. I'm assuming eventually, though, when this report has been produced, it will come to this committee to approve to council anyway. So if we felt that they hadn't approached it in an appropriate manner, it would be something at that point we could say, hang on a minute, we don't think you've taken this into account, or you've been overly zealous about this effect or something like that. And surely that would be down for this committee to be responding to that. Would be my thinking on it. But it's not a reason to delay it.
Thank you, Councillor Grover. Simon.
Apologies. Yeah, certainly to answer Councillor Grover's question. The final report would be brought back, which is usually the case for any report that we receive from consultants, just to to present the findings to members of the committee. What I will say is that when we do contract out for one of these pieces of work, it's not just here's the brief, this is what you've got to do, go away and do it, and then 4 months later, 5 months later, we get the final report. We work quite closely with the consultants on, I mean, to be honest, it's almost on a daily basis, but certainly on a weekly basis, depending on the nature of the piece of work that's being done. We will usually have stages built in for submitting draft reports as well. So we do, for want of a better phrase, keep an eye on the work and how it's progressing. The other thing I will just say is that if we do get this work done, and again, things change significantly between the point of getting the work done and the point at which we're looking to submit the review, there is always the opportunity to get that work refreshed again. There is going to be an additional cost, but it wouldn't be anywhere near as much as getting the work done again in sort of wholesale. So it comes down to balance and when do you actually get these bits of work done. But I think my view is that this is now is about the right time to get it done, to have it prepared in a timely fashion for us submitting the review, but to also hopefully pick up some of the changes in trends that have happened as a result of COVID-19 so far.
Can I just quickly come back in, Mr. Chairman?
Of course.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Simon, obviously you've explained well that it's not just a process of sort of here's the work, go and do it, come back. To alleviate any concerns on this committee, would it be possible, or would it be out of sync to say that we could get regular reports when we met on how that progress was going, or how your interactions were going, or would that be a miss to request that?
I don't see why not. It may be that I come to committee and say I have nothing to report, or anything particular to report at that stage. But I don't see why I can't give a quick verbal update if that's something that's permissible, Chairman, at committee.
Yeah, I'd be happy for you to do that, Simon. I think it feels to me that what we have, to pick up on Councillor Howard's wording of it, what we have is significantly more out of date than what we would have with this study. We need this study to be more up to date in order to have a more viable evidence base on which to review the local plan. But clearly, if things continue to change, then it's less of a task to review this study once it's done than effectively to pause this now and try and do the whole thing at a later date, which will push the plan review further back and knock all of the work programme and the policies and things that we're really keen to get right further and further into the future.
Yeah, I would agree. We're in relatively exceptional circumstances at the moment as well, and I think it's important to keep a close eye on this, certainly this particular piece of work, given the impacts on our local economy and wider economy as well.
Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder if, in some ways, the questioning so far might be sort of looking at the right thing in the wrong way. I think we are in exceptional times. I think things will change between now and May or whenever the work begins. Things may change even more disastrously between then and the following Christmas and the following May. And I wonder if, in part, the value of this work might be in us monitoring that process. Because I know that ultimately what we're looking at is, should we have a bunch of new big shops encouraged around here, which isn't always what people want. People want small businesses, et cetera, and that's all great. But in the process of looking at what we have and how footfall is working and how those businesses are surviving, it might also, if we design the project in such a way, it might also give us a little bit of a notion of the canary in the mine on the high street as well. And it might give us some sort of ongoing process whereby we can see, oh, well, this high street is failing, this high street is succeeding, these businesses need more support, etc. And it might just give us a little bit more data and research on those things and help us help other businesses, existing businesses and so on. And really, it could be a really valuable piece of work. Aside from its ultimate goal, you know, in doing those other monitoring pieces of work, if we design it to do that, whether that's even possible.
Thank you, Simon.
Yeah, certainly. In answer to your questions, Councillor Smith, I think I'd be very cautious about trying to tender for what's effectively an open-ended contract. Companies that are bidding are reluctant to get sort of tied into those. In my experience, a fixed date contract running from X to Y over a certain set amount of months with a fixed work program is certainly easier for them to tender for. It's much easier for everyone to manage as well. So I'd be cautious about changing that aspect of the work. I think what you're talking about is very valuable in terms of gaining a better understanding of how our town centres and the economy are working. And I think there's a lot of crossovers with the economic development team and the work they do. The retail studies and the economic baseline study, which I brought to committee, I think a couple of months ago, and we're currently out to tender for as well, about to award contract on that, in fact. The economic baseline study and the retail studies will both help to understand trends across the district, and they will assist the economic development team as well in the work that they're doing. And we also do monitor both the employment land estates, so effectively your business parks and your industrial estates, and we also monitor the vacancy rates and uses within the defined town centres as well. So there is already monitoring in place for those, which does give us an additional evidence base to help us understand basically what's happening in terms of the economy, our town centres and our business parks across the district.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, just to reinforce what Simon's just said, in terms of what this is trying to do is provide one strand of evidence that will ultimately lead us to looking at our retail policies as a whole, and that's going to comprise quantitative data and evidence, which, you know, there's this survey, there's the employment work, etc. But then there's going to be the qualitative side, which will involve liaison with ED colleagues, etc., and actually then will inform the overall package that comes forward as the retail policies and the implications therein for the various aspects of the district. So yes, this is one strand that we're looking to do, and take your point, Councillor Smith, about it's another level of insight to actually what's going on at the current moment in time, bearing in mind it is just a snapshot.
Thank you very much, Mike. I mean, I can't myself really add a great deal to what I said a few moments ago. That this is something that is essential for us to be able to progress with reviewing the local plan. But I think it's really useful to pick up on the comments of members of the committee that we certainly will factor in. I'm happy to make sure that we have reports and updates on how this goes on our future meetings, as and when there's something tangible there for Simon to report. And clearly, if circumstances change over the course of next year, then we will need to refresh it. And if we didn't refresh it at that point, I imagine an inspector that's doing our local plan review will tell us to go away and refresh it. So I think I'm happy to take on board all of those points. But if I see no more speakers on this, we have to take a formal vote because we're looking to go out to tender on this. So I'll formally move from the chair that the committee agrees that the Planning Policy and Research Service Manager carries out the tender exercise based on the outline brief set out in this paper and appoints an appropriate consultant. And I would need a second for that, please.
I'll second that.
Thank you very much, Councillor Grover. And I'll ask Elaine, if no one else has anything that they'd like to raise on this, I'll ask if Elaine could take the roll call, please. You're muted, Elaine.
Sorry about that. I thought I'd muted myself. Could I just advise that as Councillor Mossop wasn't present for the whole of the debate, if you would abstain from voting?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very
Elaine,
much.
yeah, I
Right,
was prepared to
okay.
do that.
Thank you. I'll just take the vote then. So Councillor Ashton.
I'm for.
Thank you. Councillor Jimmy Brooks.
For.
Councillor Dennis is an apology. Councillor Dickinson is an apology. Councillor Grover.
For.
Councillor Howard.
For.
Councillor Kemp.
For.
Councillor Macmillan.
For.
Councillor McNally.
For.
Councillor Matthews is an apology. Councillor Smith.
For.
And Councillor Mossop is abstain. Thank you very much. That concludes the vote. It's carried.
Thank you very much, Elaine.
Thank you.
The next item we have is item 7, the briefing paper on the local plan policies for review. And again, I'll ask Simon to take us through that, please.
Yep, certainly. Thank you, Chairman. So the purpose of this next item is to present members with the table of policies and an assessment of the level of review proposed for each of the policies. As part of the review, we have to submit to the inspector a statement effectively which sets out the policies that we are intending to review and why. So it's important that we know from the outset which policies we are focusing on in terms of a full review, and then which ones we're looking at partial review, and then finally which ones we're not actually making any significant changes to. I will say at this stage that when we say no significant changes, it's likely that pretty much every policy will have some tweaking of wording, but that will only be very minor in some cases. And obviously a full review is looking at the entire policy. The idea of this is to actually agree a starting point, excuse me, so that we have a clear steer from members which policies are in which category, so we know what we're working to. It may be that the table changes, that policies change in terms of their category as the review progresses. The main reason is likely to be if we get additional evidence in that shows something does urgently need reviewing, or in actual fact, some evidence that actually says, well, in actual fact, we thought there was an issue with this policy, but the evidence is now saying that it's fine. So that could be a reason why a policy changes. And the other key one that could change the need for a policy to be reviewed is changes in national policy. So we have the Environment Bill and the Planning White Paper at the moment, which may well have significant implications on planning policy and the whole planning system. So as I say, this is really a starter for 10. Sorry, Mike, I've stolen your phrase there, but I quite like it. A starter for 10, really, to get people discussing the policies and to try and get an idea now as to what the starting point is in terms of categories. I will just go through quickly the different categories that we've got at the top there. I'm going to keep looking to the right because I've actually got the table up on a different computer screen, so apologies. I'm not ignoring you. The main one is the inspector identified issue. That sort of speaks for itself. It's where the inspector at the examination previously has identified that there is an issue with that policy and it will need looking at the point of review. So they were satisfied that it would be sound at that point in time, but going forwards to the review, it's something that definitely needed looking at. Does not align with corporate priorities. Again, I mean, all of these sort of do what they say on the tin, really. But again, if corporate priorities change or shift in any way, then it may be that the policies also need to be reviewed as well to stay in line with that. We have a balance to stay in line with corporate priorities and also in line with the National Planning Policy Framework as well. Climate change, carbon reduction, see very, very big topic at the moment. The Environment Bill is potentially going to introduce lots of significant elements in that. Again, it's important to make sure that local plan policies align with those aspirations. does not adequately promote economic growth and recovery. I mean, again, COVID-19 and the changing trends that may well be identified are something that could mean that our policies need looking at. I've already mentioned changes in national policy and guidance. And then the final one, which is the evidence base needs reviewing or refreshing, which is the work that I bring to the committee to go out to tender to usually. So what I will say is we are on a short timescale for review, as you know. We've got 4 years to do it as opposed to the 5 years that is sort of set out as the usual in the National Planning Policy Framework, the usual timescale. So I think it's for me, it's important that we do identify what are our key priorities in terms of review at this stage. There may be things that we would like to review, but they aren't actually essential at this stage. And we need to make sure that we're not spreading ourselves, resources, time too thinly to the point where either we don't cover one of the key issues fully or we sort of fail to hit that submission date and we drift out of date, the local plan drifts out of date. So I think that's important just to make sure we identify which are these key policies that we are reviewing. Effectively, that's me done. I think the key thing here is now to open it up for people to discuss whether they agree or don't agree. I will need some kind of reasoning if policies are to be moved. That's because I have to justify it to the inspector why we put a policy in a particular category, why we have reviewed something or not. And then when the actual table is finalised following comments from today, it will be brought back to committee just to confirm that. I think you'll see in the recommendations also that if we are making any significant changes to it, then we would bring it back, but any minor changes will be delegated to myself and Mike. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Councillor Howard.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of quick points. I noted that for SP19, and I will at this point just say that I've not gone back to it and read it, but I noticed that it doesn't actually come under having a reason for review, and it just says significant alterations to the wording. Considering we've just done this piece of work on the LDO, I just thought that that wouldn't probably mean that we'd got to do more than a significant bit of wording change. But as I say, I've not gone back and read the policy and worked out the relevance of that. So then the other one was SP12, and there's some concerns there for me. Again, as there's no reason for review, in that, as I understand the situation at the moment, there is significant difficulties in bringing forward the borough site, which is, the main kind of site that we were looking at. And in Mablethorpe, we allocated a small number of units to the industrial estate on the grounds that the industrial estate was almost dormant. Now, since then, there's been, significant moves on there to bring business on. By all means, there is still space there, but with looking at the Towns Fund, there are elements within that could easily result in businesses wanting to relocate from the town centre over to the industrial estate and probably gobble up most of this other space that's still there. So my concerns are that the main site was borough, and it seems to be having difficulties. I don't know what all those difficulties are. And then the second site was here in Mablethorpe, on the ground for a particular reason, that the ground wasn't being used for anything, and now the initial purpose of that ground does seem to be coming to fruition. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Simon, would you like to pick up on these as we go through?
Yeah, certainly. You'll notice that there are a few there that don't have what's a reason for a few. I think for clarity, I may change the title to that to main reasons for review. I mean, it's not possible to put an exhaustive list of categories. Those are the chief ones that could trigger a review. But I think it might be helpful to maybe have a column in there, other as well, to try and pick up any other reasons that there might be for a review. In terms of SP19, excuse me, the significant changes to the wording relate really to at the moment, the significant changes that we know of relate to the changes brought about through the LDO and alterations to the seasonal occupancy. The policy the policy is quite explicit in there, and the shift away from what it says, to my mind, is quite a significant change in the approach. So that's why that's in there as a significant change to the wording. However, at this stage, the policy doesn't appear to be, the policy appears to be working, and there's no proposal to actually do a full review of that policy. In terms of SP12, which is, as you say, the Gypsy Travellers and Show People, I'm aware that there are discussions on bringing forwards all three of the key sites that we have in the district, Mablethorpe being allocated, one on the edge of Louth, and the Borough site as well. I must admit that I'm not fully briefed on exactly what stage any of those at, but I am aware that discussions are still being carried out, and I'm not aware that any of them have now been ruled out. So as far as I'm concerned, that they're still relevant and could still come forwards to meet our demand. Unless Mike has anything to add on that particular subject, there's not much more I can go into. But as I say, in relation to SP12, if things do change, if we do discover that suddenly a number of our sites can't come forwards or won't be coming forwards, the need to review that might change, and it may be that we need to actually refresh some of the evidence there in that case, and look at potentially finding new sites as well. So that might be a reason why that particular policy does change in category at some point.
Thank you, Simon. Mike.
Yeah, just to reiterate, the Gypsy and Travellers policy is one that is always a thorny issue at examination, and inspectors are quite keen on it. It's one where people's evidence base can get them into trouble. So we are going to be very much led by what happens in terms of trend and actual delivery on the ground over the coming period, but also evidence base as we move forward. And as Simon said, we're going to have to be more reactionary in that regard. I think the policy itself still aligns with national planning policy, and there is separate national planning policy for Gypsy and Travellers. So provided we're still meeting that requirement, we'll just have to pick up any relatively minor changes that we anticipate through the process. So that's why it is in as it is. And coming back to the point, I was going to nick the SP19 one as the easier one of the two subject areas, and say in essence it is because we've got the approach with the LDO. We want to encourage the extended season along the coast, and we just need to make sure that those aspirations align with what is an incredibly lengthy policy in terms of SP19 as well. So it might be an opportunity for us to actually slim that policy down, but still achieve the same aim. So that's why it's in the manner that it is.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for those explanations. That's been helpful. Thank you.
I just pick up at that point that we are still committed to delivering the sites which were contained in the local plan which were adopted, and given the efforts that have already been expended, I'm keen that we don't resile from them too far. All I can really say at this stage is that discussions are ongoing of how to bring those sites forward, and we're committed to doing so as ever we possibly can.
Yes, because we have been traditionally a little bit slow in getting this problem solved, haven't we? I'll leave it at that. I think
we have been slow, but it's not through lack of will. We can't. It's not a hook that we can wriggle off of. Very clearly, we don't have a local plan, and we won't get a local plan review unless we've solved this.
I would say that there is the will now. There may not have been in the early days. I'll leave it at that. I've got too much of a memory on this council, I'm afraid.
Thank you. The other point I would make on SP19 is that this committee approved supplementary guidance that I think is quite relevant a few months ago, which gave effect to change the emphasis around SP19. And I imagine that will, if there's anything to be picked up on, that will be picked up on. The next speaker I have is Councillor Grover.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I apologise to Councillor Smith if he was about to mention this. It's certainly not intended to steal your thunder. But following last night's meeting and the work of the panel on carbon reduction and climate change that you excellently chaired, there were obviously a couple of comments that you made where we were seeing the assets change to Alford, and although it was pointed out, you know, we can't save the planet. I do think it's important that we do provide leadership, and I'm just interested to see why the climate change carbon reduction comment doesn't apply to more of the policies. Now it might be because they're not directly affected by it, but I do think that in the future, you know, a lot more about what we do and how we act and the policies that we implement are going to be judged on these merits. And obviously, Simon previously mentioned you might put in an additional column to things that might need to be based on that. So yeah, I just wanted to raise that because I just think, you know, we might not be being judged on them at the moment in technical terms, but I do think in future these things are going to be more and more pressing, and I just think it is important that we do provide leadership on that.
That you were stealing my thunder a little bit there, Will. Could I go next before Simon answers so that he can?
Yes, of course you can.
Is that okay, Chair?
Go on.
Thank you. Thank you. I was very pleased to see that was that section on climate change and carbon reduction. I noticed that the policy that you mentioned that we will need to be incorporating is the Environment Act, which is a very important act and cuts, as Will says, across a whole host of policies and areas of planning. And when there's a new piece of legislation comes in, it's often it sort of overwhelms previous pieces of legislation which are still relevant, etc. And I think because it's new, we have a tendency to look towards the Environment Act first. And obviously the Environment Act is an act about the environment. It's not actually an act about climate change and carbon reduction. It has elements of that in it, but you mustn't conflate the two. And I would very much like to see us repeatedly referring to the Climate Change Act of 2008 and the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act of 2004, particularly Section 19, where it relates to carbon reduction in planning, because from the evidence of our last local plan, this hasn't been incorporated in the past. And one of the things that we did find was in the past, the distant past now, you know, this wasn't an issue for this council, and it hasn't been carried through in the detail of policy. So I'd very much like to see those two pieces of legislation, as well as the excellent Environment Act, reflected, as Will says, throughout all of our policies thank you.
Thank you very much. Simon, is there anything there that you'd like to pick up on?
Only to reassure the councillors that absolutely, I mean, climate change, carbon reduction, and the environment bill and what will be the subsequent act will play a huge part in pretty much every policy. I mean, I could, in theory, have coloured in every single policy green, because it's going to be something that we have to have as a theme running through the local plan. And we'll need to look at every policy to make sure that it is helping to combat climate change, helping us to meet our carbon reduction targets as well. Obviously, the council have its own carbon reduction targets that are set, and also helping to provide enhancement to the environment as well. One of the key things being the net gain requirement that will more than likely be introduced through the Environment Bill. So yeah, it will all be sort of taken into account as we work through the local plan review, and I'm working closely with Sarah Baker, the Climate Change and Environment Manager as well. I've already spoken to her on various different things at this stage. So yeah, I mean, we're lucky that we have a person in that position with her experience that can be involved with the process.
Thank you. And Councillor McNally.
Thank you, Chairman. I've lost it. Hang on. Yeah, just a couple of bits and pieces. SP4, he says that they'll full review of the policy. Although actually, I think it works quite. I don't know quite what, but actually, as a generally, I think it actually worked quite well compared to some of the other ones. The coastal East Lindsey, and it says about the list of settlements that the coastal zone applies to, and I did look through the minutes, and I brought this up in like 2 years ago in December, and there was, I think it was Granthorpe, Marshchapel, Hogsthorpe, and maybe somewhere that wasn't included within the coastal zone. There was actually classed as villages, yet the coastal zone it covered them. And I did ask for it to be investigated, and it never was. So I'm presuming that all this lot is going to be clumped together as one within the coastal zone as it is on the map, and not just because what we can't have is one policy for one place that's in the coastal zone, another one for another one. It has to be a consistent approach throughout, whether that's to allow housing or not to allow housing. I presume that's what we're getting at with that one. The holiday accommodation, does that include the brick-built holiday accommodation for the season? Because I think there's been some recently where some people have submitted housing for a sort of holiday cottage, then they've restricted the occupancy, and then the Environment Agency have said, no, actually, we don't have an objection, and then it's been extended. So is that going for more clarity? And the single plot exception one, which is SP9, so we're going back again. I don't know if you could review it, but I really don't like that. At one point, it was at 60% of the market value, and I don't think that's unless it's been moved. At one point, it was 60%, but I think if it is 60% of the market value, I think it needs readjusting. That's it. Thank you,
Simon.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at. I've got another screen that's got the local planner, but I'll just go through them in order if that's okay, Councillor McNally. Yeah, I take your point regarding SP4, and it is something that Mike and myself did have a discussion about. I think we've included it, or I've included it, because we are looking, as you'll see in the issues and options paper, we are looking at the spatial strategy for housing distribution and delivery across the district. And SP4 does form part of the policy set that helps us to deliver our housing, and it's part of the spatial strategy. That's why it's included. So as we look at, as you'll see in the issues and options paper, as we look at whether we even have a coastal split or not, how we distribute housing across the district, towns, villages, what have you, as we look at that, inevitably every policy that relates to housing is going to be looked at as part of that, because they all form part of the spatial strategy. So SP4 is in there for that reason. So I take your point, and it maybe isn't as critical to review that in isolation but it does form part of the review of the whole spatial strategy for housing. SP9 single plot. It's just looking at the policy. Resale market value of the development we fixed at 80%. So that's fixed at an 80% figure in SP9.
That's fine. I know at one point it was 60%, and I know that was what I can't remember if it was still at that or not.
60% does sound very low, so I'm not surprised you raised that. But yeah, it's 80% is in the policy. Yeah. SP17. Yes, there's always been some ambiguity as to what's in the coastal zone and what isn't. In my previous life as a development management officer, it was quite difficult when you had a named settlement and you had a map as well to look at. So you had the two different things that were defining what was in the coastal zone, but they didn't actually tally up together. I think there needs to be better clarity as to how we define what policies apply in what location. Some of that will come down to whether we have a coastal zone defined, as I've said already, and whether we even have that going forwards. And then working out how we actually write the policies relating to properties that are potentially in a coastal area and properties that aren't. Getting down to the nitty gritty of how policies are written is something that will happen sort of further down the line. But I do agree that there is some clarity there needed between which settlements are covered by which particular policies. And I think there is a bit of ambiguity there. Well, there can be in the current plan. And SP19, and I think again we were getting more into the nitty gritty of that when you were talking about the differences between bricks and mortar accommodation when you and other types of accommodation and different approaches taken. And I think again that we've got in there significant alterations to the wording. We are looking at the occupancy of the accommodation and different types of accommodation. So what you talk about will naturally form part of that, and how the occupancy is applied to the different types of accommodation in the sort of areas. I'll stop saying coastal zone because we may not have that. I'll say in the areas that are at risk of flooding. I think that answers all of the 4 questions.
It does indeed, sir. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I mean, just pick up on that on SP9. Do we know what response, how many applications we've had to take advantage of SP9 since the plan was adopted?
The short answer is no. I can find out very easily, relatively easily. The slightly more long-winded answer is that, again, in my time as a DM officer, I think I only ever dealt with 1. I suspect the numbers are very low for the single plot exception policy.
Thank you. I mean, I share Councillor McNally's view really of SP4, although we're going to pick up in the spatial strategy on the issues and options paper, which is the next item we've got on the agenda. And that will be something that is picked up there. I know that the pressures that come from medium settlements wanting more growth than we're allowing here in SP4, which is effectively 2 for infill. And I know that there's pressure from large villages and towns that would prefer their medium and small settlement to take a little bit of the burden that's currently falling on them. But specifically, there's some really good stuff in SP4 around redevelopment of sites for housing will be supported where those sites are brownfield or have agricultural buildings on them that have become disused. I would, for my part, and I'd be interested to hear the views of committee, be interested to see whether we could take that a little bit further and look at that outside of medium and small settlements where there are buildings which have become redundant, farm buildings, possibly become derelict, or maybe old cottages or old houses that have long since become derelict, and include something that encourages their restoration and their reuse, and to put them to good use. That doesn't quite fit in with any policy that we've got. Because SP4 is medium and small. We've got rural exception policies at SP8, but that is for effectively affordable housing. That's for an identified need, rather than there is something here that has come to the end of its natural life that could be reasonably repurposed. It is in a location that we certainly wouldn't usually encourage new market housing, but it's not as though we're encouraging a new build, it's encouraging the reuse of something which is already there, prevent its further decay, and in some cases maybe even prevent an eyesore occurring. I mean, if that's something that members of the committee would like you to include, you'd be pushing an open door, because I would really like to include something on that. But Councillor Mossop, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, well, just on that particular point, Chairman, I would support you on that. I think that repurposing of old buildings in an imaginative way in the countryside, although DM or officers would probably say it isn't, I would call it sustainable development. If you can have good connectivity, you can work from home, as we all are at the moment. I even cycled to my farm office today in the rain. So, these things can happen. So, yeah, I think that's a really good idea. Going back to SP4, which is where you think this could sit quite nicely, I would also, I represent, all my villages are inland medium villages and small villages. And as Councillor McDally has said, I think the policy has worked reasonably well, that you can very easily define, because the development has been allowed within the confines of the village and doesn't extend the village. I think that's a very clear definition that the villages and parishes can understand. And I could very much sort of try and guide parishes, which I think is part of my responsibility and role, is to support the local plan in as much as best way I can, by trying to explain these. And we had a very good debate in one of the villages about this very SP4 policy, and it worked. And as a result of that, they're now very clear about where they can't be developed in that particular community. However, I think, like you say, and I know you represent a large village that has the propensity to include very large estates on the edge of it in some of the communities you represent. I think that there is an imbalance between those large communities and the large villages and the medium size. And I think that some of the medium can take a little bit more. So that rule of 2 is perhaps something that we could have a look at and see whether it could be extended, so that a bit more. I think the design of villages that were close-knit, small communities in the old days can be replicated with that in trying to develop a core of a village in some of these communities and medium-sized ones. So I think, with good design and good architects following it, I think the rule can be slightly more relaxed than the rule of 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Mossop. And I tend to concur with your point on the rule of 2. Sometimes there's a gap that's a bit bigger than 2. So, yeah, that's something I'm sure we can pick up. Simon and Mike, please.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, certainly SB4 is something that, as I say, will will form part of the actual review of the spatial strategy, and looking at the actual distribution and dispersal of housing across the district is something that will be looked at under the issues and options exercise as well. So all of those aspects sort of feed into that, and we will see what comes out of that and what direction the public through consultation feel we should take, and then ultimately what direction members and the council feel we should take in terms of the spatial distribution of housing. And that looks at where we actually allocate and distribute housing, whether it's towns, medium, large, small villages, or all over the place. So there's all those different, that range of options to be considered. Just picking up on the chairman's point about reuse of buildings. The longer serving members may recall the old local plan, which actually did have a policy in it. I'll stick my neck out and say it was DC5. I can't quite remember, but that did actually look at the reuse of buildings in the countryside in rural locations for a variety of uses. I think there was one that looked at reuse for business and employment uses, and another one that did specifically look at the reuse for housing as well. We don't actually have a specific policy in this local plan that covers it, but the National Planning Policy Framework is advocating that in paragraph 79 as well, the reuse of redundant buildings. The idea being that if a building's already there, it's inherently more sustainable to reuse it than actually expend energy building a brand new structure. So again, that is something that we'll have to look at how it will actually fit in. It is something that we can look at whether it forms part of the wider spatial strategy, whether it's what is effectively a bolt-on policy that sits alongside that as an extra layer of support for that particular type of development, whether it fits in with SP4. As Mike's alluded to, I'm conscious of not having policies that go on and on and on for days on end. And I think we need to avoid that if it's all possible, and keep it sort of quite clear and concise as to what we're trying to achieve. That may involve having more individual policies, but they're all sort of valid points and things that I think a lot of it will be picked up through the issues and options exercise, and as we move forward, looking at the spatial strategy.
Thank you. And Mike?
Yeah, I'm not going to labour the point too much, other than say we're not trying to write the precise policy at this moment in time, but the sentiment of what's being said we can pick up, certainly because we have to pick it up in light of the fact that the plan that we've got was adopted pre the latest variant of the NPPF anyway. So we need to make sure that that is compliant, and that's not to say that the government won't release another revision to the NPPF before we even get to a review stage. So if it does, we'll have to pick that up and make sure it all aligns. But I think certainly the approach to those areas that are countryside, let's call them that for one, for the ease, is one that we're going to have a look at, and we might be able to make some tweaks here and there to pick up. Principally, what you're talking about is windfall development, which is a large proportion of our housing supply and housing delivery. So it would be remiss of us to just completely ignore that fact, given that we'll be saying to an inspector, we need to place some reliance on it moving forward.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think our discussion has come very close to merging with the next item on our agenda, and seeing that we don't have any further hands, my understanding is that we need to formally approve this. So to that effect, I would move recommendations 1 to 3 on page 42 of our papers, and look for a seconder, please. Thank you, Councillor Mossop. I saw you waving at me first. I'll ask Elaine if she could kindly take the vote, please.
Thank you, Chair. Am I on mute?
You are unmuted.
I am this time, yeah. Sorry, just bear with me. Right, I'm ready. Take the vote now, Chairman. Councillor Ashton.
For.
Councillor Jimmy Brooks.
For.
Councillor Dennis is an apology. Councillor Dickinson is an apology. Councillor Grover.
I think that was Grover. For.
Yes. Councillor Howard.
For.
Councillor Kemp.
For.
Councillor Macmillan.
For.
Councillor McNally.
For.
Councillor Matthews is an apology. Councillor Smith.
For.
Councillor Mossop.
4.
Thank you very much. That concludes the vote. It's carried.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Our final substantive item we've got today is the briefing paper on the issues and options exercise. And again, Simon, if you could kindly take us through the report, please.
Yeah, certainly, Chairman. I'll keep this very brief. I'm conscious that this may take quite a bit of discussion again, and there's not a whole lot for me to say. I introduced a paper to members towards the end of last year, setting out what the issues and options process was, and we've already talked about it again today. So I think members will be sort of fully aware of what the actual process is. The paper is attached as a refresh anyway. Just in brief for anyone that's not aware, effectively we set out a list of what we feel are the key issues in the district, and then a set of various options that we feel address them. And then we put it out to consultation so anyone can comment on it. They're not tied to just the options that we suggest. If they feel that none of the options are appropriate, then they can say that, but we would like them to say why and potentially suggest any other options that they feel are more appropriate. So there are sort of sections in the paper for that. The paper is very much in draft form at the moment. Part of the reason being that really wanted to speak to committee and make sure that the principles, the framework of what we're asking are acceptable. It's quite a lengthy document, so I'm not asking you to pick through all the wording of it. We're looking at the sort of principles, the issues that have been identified, the issues we're carrying forwards and asking people about, and then whether the options that tie into that are appropriate as well. That's basically what we're looking for at this stage. I would, once we've had the comments here, I will go away and obviously incorporate those changes, turn it into what will be a formal consultation document, and then it will be brought back to committee for that final sign off before going to board and then out to consultation. So that's basically it from me, and I'll open the floor again if Chairman's okay with that to questions.
Thank you very much for that, Simon. I think one of the challenges that we've had with the current local plan is that as part of the issues and options exercise, there was a general feeling at that time from members that we should be pursuing a more dispersed spatial strategy than the one that we came in the end. And I think this is our opportunity, and the undertaking I'll give to you as chairman holder is that I am keener to ensure that the view that members representing ward communities, how they see the district developing and going forward is reflected in what we do here in this committee and in planning policy. So it will be absolutely key that when this when this goes out, that we get good responses and that people do respond to it, because we will genuinely be listening. Councillor McNally.
Thank you, Chairman. Actually, I think it's really good. And it's got lots of different options for people to choose from, not just one or two. There's numerous different options, and you can write one yourself if you think you feel like it. But the main thing is when's I mean, I said about this to the parish council I think it was last week, and we was going to put it on the agenda for next month. So will it be out by then or not?
It will have to. I'll let Simon answer that, just on when this is likely to hit the public, or Mike.
I'll jump in.
Okay, go for it, Mike.
In terms of what we've got, obviously we're in draft form at the minute. If we get members' endorsement today, we'll look to finalise that over the next month and a little bit. Look to bring this back to the policy committee for sign off on the final version back end of the year, with a view to then getting it on executive board before we go out to consult early next year. Obviously, with the current situation, we just need to also make sure that the manner in which we undertake that consultation is compliant with the government's relaxation as a result of COVID-19, so that we can undertake that consultation in a robust fashion. Because what we don't want to do is, again, trip ourselves over at examination by not fulfilling something early doors in the correct manner. So that's the timeline, Dan. I'm heartened to hear that you think that we've covered a number of different options on that. You could go on forever and a day, but we want to try and get something that is quite focused and that people can engage with. And actually, it's tangible. They can feel the options and understand what they are. But equally, being mindful of that overall framework that we've got to have this review done and dusted and in a very short period of time. So that's where we go next, in essence.
Thank you very much, Mike. I've just spotted a typo on the paper because I was looking at page 62, about to answer Councillor McNally, and it said 13th of the 1st, 2020. And just before I was about to speak, I thought that can't be right. So sorry for passing that straight over to you guys. The one thing I would pick up on from given the consultation due to commence mid-January 2021, it says running for 6 weeks, appreciating that parish councils sometimes miss their January meeting. Could I suggest that we do an 8-week consultation on that, so that we make absolutely sure that we cover any and all parishes that are out there that might not have a January meeting and struggle to get it in for February, just so that, would that be possible?
I mean, as usual, they're usually statutory minimums in terms of consultation. So if we feel there's a need to introduce some flexibility to that, I see no reason why not. And I think, given the fact that all the circumstances around COVID are very much likely to still be in effect in the early part of next year, I think there's every reason to employ a little bit more flexibility in terms of that consultation exercise. I've no problem with that at all. So I can extend that by an extra 2 weeks to 8 weeks. And my sincere apologies for the typo with the 2020 and the 2021. It's hard when you're thinking about the next year.
Don't worry, it keeps me on my toes. Councillor Mossop.
Thank you. One thing I've just thought about as you were talking about the practicalities of sending this out to parish councils is I really do hope that before it does go out, that we have a session with all our district councillors so that they can go to their parishes fully armed with what this is all about, because it's a confusing issue. And I think, we can help them shape their future in a lot better way if we're well prepared for it. I know I've tried to do that over the years, and I know that parishes appreciate the help, that kind of help. So if we can be trained up, it will help us enormously to give the message out, to make sure that they actually fill these blooming forms in. They're really important, and it's really important to see their points of view, particularly in terms of housing distribution. And I think that's where perhaps I would just like to see this document try and be as simple as possible, so that it is completely idiot proof. I'm not being rude about parishes, but it's for my benefit as well. That we put it in very simple language. So let's have a English proofing a session after this before it goes into the full final draft to the executive board, and perhaps the order of the questioning might be something that we look at, because the one thing I think that parishes are interested in is settlement hierarchy and the housing distribution, whether their village should grow or not grow. So that's, I think, one area. In terms of one of the options I think that you've put in towards the end of all this is about they just call it a new town. I think we need to just explain that in a little bit more detail, that actually it doesn't necessarily mean we plonk a Poundbury in the middle of nowhere, as Prince Charles bolted on to Dorchester, but something that there are options within options on something like a new town. And I think if you just explain that at the moment to members sort of perhaps in the Grimmelby-Manby area in the past, they would be horrified, because that was one of the suggestions back in the about 10 years ago, and it fell very flat on its face. Albeit by accident, now Grimmelby and Manby have developed quite considerably. So I think that's a bit of wording there that might be just looked at to see whether we call it a new an extension to an existing village or not a new town. I don't know. I think we just needs a bit of thought on that. And I think the one of the key questions and options for the area is this issue about whether there's any benefit in keeping this coastal zone. So, you know, I support that fully, that should be there. So, yeah, I think it's a good document. Make it simple. Make us go out there and deliver it to our parishes and help us by training us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Mossop. It was only a couple of days ago when I was running through the agenda with Mike and Simon that I suggested that we probably wouldn't be looking at a new town in the period of our current local plan. However, if there was overwhelming support for one, then I think we should call it Poundbury under Wold. But you do raise very valid, very serious points in terms of member briefing, and I'd also say parish clerk and parish council briefings. Now, these have always, for East Lindsey, been notoriously poorly attended. I find member point briefs difficult to do in the daytime. And whenever we tried doing things in the evening, when they've been physical meetings, attendance has been woeful. We've got a fantastic opportunity, I think, this time around, utilising Zoom to do member briefings. I would suggest, as a start of a 10, we look to do a member briefing, an afternoon and an evening session, and we look at doing a parish council briefing, possibly an afternoon, but more realistically a good evening session in January. And I'd be keen for us to do that to help explain what is clearly quite an extensive document, to give better understanding to our members and better understanding to parish councils. Simon and Mike.
Thank you, Chairman. So I just made some quick notes on Councillor Mossop's questions, but you've answered the first one about training and briefing for parish councils, etc. I'm happy for myself or one of my team to assist and attend those, obviously, if needed. Yeah, in terms of making it idiot-proof in plain English, that is a key aim. It needs to be, and not written in technical language. With the best will in the world, I've tried to do it myself, but inevitably, because I'm a professional officer, that it is very difficult for technical language to sometimes not creep in. So what I would like, if members feel it's okay, if you do have any suggestions in terms of the plain English side of it, any wording that you feel is too technical or isn't appropriate, if you drop me a quick email just to highlight it, because ultimately we'll be bringing this back again to committee anyway, so those tweaks can be made, and then committee can see the final document at the end. If there is anything that you feel that the members of your wards might not be able to understand, so perhaps act as a bridge between the two. In terms of the ordering, Councillor Mossop, you mentioned housing distribution first. We start off with, I'm just looking at it now, so we start off with changing the plan period and agreeing the plan period. That's obviously got to change. And the second thing being, sorry, forgive me.
All the policies.
The policies to be reviewed, yeah. And then we go after that. We then go straight into the coastal inland split, which needs to be the starting point of the spatial strategy discussion. So the only two bits that preclude that, or come before that, are those questions of the plan period and agreeing the policies to review. They could be moved to the end, but they are fairly strategic, overarching introductory questions, and they're very short. I don't know. I'm very much open to suggestions and can move those questions to the end, so we go straight into the housing strategy if you feel that's appropriate and a better way of doing it. My view was that having those introductory bits about the plan period and the policy to review were probably better at the top to set the scene, so people knew we were going to be extending it and the policies that we were looking at. But I'm open to suggestions on that, certainly.
I just thought that the table of policies might be a bit of a turn-off, that's all. And I think it's something that is a bit for the strategic ones and also the agents. And they're the ones that will go through these issues and options plans very thoroughly. And I thought the meaty bits for the parishioners and parishes and the public is probably the spatial strategy. There will be obviously some people interested in the policy, but I just thought that table of policies is quite lengthy because we've seen it in the previous appendix, haven't we? So I just think that may be better at the bottom. That's all.
If I can come back, yeah, I think that's a fair comment, and I would agree that that's something, that particular bit could be placed towards the end. I think that's a fair comment if committee feel that that's the more appropriate way of doing it. Yeah. And the final question was about the option of a new town. I'll try and flesh out a bit more detail and make that sound a little bit softer, and not an eco town or a Poundsbury dropped somewhere in the middle of nowhere. So I will have a look at the wording for that.
Thank you. And Mike.
Yeah, I mean, all I was going to say was one of the things we'll look to do now, once we've got members' endorsement, hopefully on the approach that we're taking. We'll get it over to James's team in terms of comms, etc., and try and simplify the document down. I'm a simple planner. I like images and drawings as opposed to lots of lengthy text. So I'm sure many people out there feel the same. And I take your point, Councillor Mossop, about the table. We can certainly slim that down and come up with a better way of displaying that. But I think I do take Simon's point that it's kind of the narrative for the document. It explains what the review is and that we are trying to frame the review quite tightly. The final point was picking up on the new town settlement approach. Yeah, we can look to soften the wording of that. It just picks up on where the government are in terms of garden villages, garden towns, but we can simplify that down to be a settlement. It ultimately is about characterising that point, because I think we need to leave that option on the table, because if the housing number goes the way the government is looking like it will go, we might need to have some inventive ways of addressing that growth, not just relying on removing the coastal inland split. So we want to have that option there in some guise. But yeah, calling it a town's one option. It could be a village, it could be a sustainable urban extension. There's many different ways of cutting that cake.
Thank you. I have Councillor Howard and Councillor Smith, and I'd like this wrapped up about 4:30 if we could. I'm conscious that Councillor Brooks is going to have to go soon.
I'm going to have to go now, unfortunately, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. No worries. Thank you, Councillor Brooks, for your time.
Unless you can fit it in 5 minutes. I've got 5 minutes possibly.
There's a challenge for you, Councillors Howard and Smith.
Right.
I'll wait 5 moments.
Just a quick question. One problem we always have calculating housing numbers is long extant planning permissions. Did we ought to be finding out what villages and towns think about those through this document? Is this the time and place?
Do you want me to come back on that, Chairman?
Yeah, go for it. Which Simon?
As part of monitoring housing supply and delivery across the district, one of the things we do look at is all of the different housing permissions that we have. And as housing permissions grow older, they're no longer counted in our figures anyway. they grow older. So, I mean, we have permissions that are extant going back to the 70s in the district, possibly even before that, and they are not considered in the housing figures at all, unless there's very, very certain evidence that they are going to suddenly come forwards. We only include ones that we have in the 5-year housing supply, for example. We only include sites that have a realistic chance of delivery within that 5-year period. So they're excluded anyway from the figures.
Mike?
Yeah, if I may, just to further elaborate on that, that was principally the reason why the inspector required a review, was, you know, the reliance on the extant permissions and existing commitments along the coast was quite a constrained narrative, and you know, the inspector raising concerns about actually, does that mean you can meet your overall housing delivery requirements? So clearly that is the fundamental reason why we're doing the review. What we're asking people to do around the issues and options is identifying those areas that we want growth. How we then deal with that will then be the next level on, in terms of, well, actually, can we just use our existing commitments? Do we need to look at allocating land and such like from there? So I think, Councillor Howard, in terms of your point, we're not asking the public to comment on that as an approach at this stage, but it clearly will be something that will be looked at as part of the review.
Thanks for that, Mike.
Thank you, Councillor Smith.
Thanks. It was a very amorphous question that I wanted to ask, which was really just about the nature of consultation at all with the public in this sort of COVID sort of period, where many of the places where we might normally find the public are closed. And I just wondered if you had new strategies for finding the public.
Good point, Councillor Smith. I mean, I presume our usual point of contact for this is the town and parish councils. I don't know whether there were what we did at this stage on the last local, when we did the local plan. I don't think I was a member of this committee at the time, but if I think if I pick up on the point that have already been made, that we need to do pretty extensive communications out there to let people know that this is going on. Other than that, I shall hand over to Simon, who might be able to answer more effectively than me.
I can't add a whole lot more to that at the moment. I mean, it will depend a little bit on the government guidance and how we are able to carry out consultations at that particular time. We will use every method we can to demonstrate that we have reached as many people as we can. Electronic means are the obvious one, but they only go so far because there are still people that don't have access to that. So it's how do we manage to access those people and give them the ability to actually feed in their comments as well, which is tough. I mean, I don't have a simple answer for you at the moment based on the current restrictions that we have. It's a difficult one to answer, but it is a robust consultation strategy for it will be essential and will be something that we look at very closely as we approach the time and we know more about what the actual government restrictions are and relaxing on consultations.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was 5 minutes. Thank you, both of you, all of you. I see no further speakers, no further hands, no one else wishing to land. Effectively, this is the draft. It will come back to this committee in December for final sign-off. So if there are any points that any members pick up subsequent to this meeting, please let Simon know. We can factor them in. The recommendation that we do need to vote on is that we agree the draft issues and options paper document, and that the final issues and options document will be brought back to committee for final sign-off with any modifications incorporated into it. I will move that formally and look for a seconder, please. Councillor McNally, and hand over to Elaine to take the vote on that, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Ashton.
For.
Councillor Brooks.
For.
Councillor Dennis is an apology. Councillor Dickinson is an apology. Councillor Grover.
4.
Councillor Howard,
4.
Councillor Kemp,
4.
Councillor Macmillan,
4.
Councillor McNally,
4.
Councillor Matthews is an apology, Councillor Smith
4.
and Councillor Mossop.
4.
Thank you, Chairman. That concludes the vote and it's carried.
Thank you very much. The final item we have is the date of the next meeting, which is Thursday the 10th. What I was going to suggest, appreciating the time pressures we seem to be under, because now we're on a 2:15 start, which was something that was introduced when we started doing these meetings electronically. Could I suggest that we in future meet at 1 o'clock, which will give us a bit longer before everyone's got to rush off for tea and children, grandchildren, and everything else. How would members of the committee be happy with a 1 o'clock start in December?
Yeah, I've noticed that meetings are starting to drift off past 5 o'clock and stuff like that. So that, you know, everyone knows where it's an afternoon. It's either an afternoon or an evening, and 1 o'clock's the afternoon.
Okay, so we'll go 1 o'clock next month, and hopefully that'll save time pressures. So thank you very much for that. Thank you again for your time. Thank you, Councillor Brooks, for staying with us to the end. Thank you all for your contributions. We've got some serious bits of business today, and I will declare the meeting closed and wish you in